Hey guys, it's On the Line. Two guests today, two very different topics. Up first, Gregory Jack, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at Ipsos. He's going to walk us through what's happening out there in the polls, including some weird ones in Quebec and Alberta, and bad news for the Conservatives on a few fronts. Coming up later in the show, David Shipley, Beauceron on security on the cyber element in the war in Iran. But first, like I said, Greg Jack from Ipsos right now here. It's On the Line. Gregory Jack of Ipsos is here with me. And Greg, I got kind of a blunt question for you. What's going on? Because I'm looking at the polling. Look, you'll tell me about Ipsos polling, obviously. That's what you'll do. But I look at the aggregators, too, that track all of them. And a few months ago, what seemed to start happening was everything had been very stable for a long time. The Liberals were maybe a point or two ahead of the Conservatives, but it was neck and neck. But since maybe January, every new polling battery that cycles through shows that the Conservatives are losing a point and the Liberals are gaining it. And it does seem to be a one-to-one switch. Conservatives go down one, Liberals go up one. So what's been happening is there's just this divergence opening up. So tell me, we'll talk about the politics in a minute. Just tell me what the numbers are. What's actually happening out there?
Well, Matt, you're right. We're seeing a consistency across all the polls. The difference varies by poll. We have the Liberals up by 8 points. Some polls just have them up by a little bit more. Some have a bit of a closer race. But certainly the Liberals under Mark Carney have opened up a larger lead than they had, at this time, maybe in December, or, as you say, right after the new year. I think there's a number of reasons that might be. If you think back to when Mark Carney ran in the election, and that was a huge shift in the polls as well. We had future Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre basically December of 2024, and everything changed. We haven't seen that kind of shift in the public environment, but we have seen Mark Carney traveling a lot. He had made that Davos speech, which I think was widely applauded. I think there are some criticisms that one could make on that speech, but I don't think that Canadians had a lot of problems with what he said. I think that it gave him the international profile. And I think Canadians are also increasingly, again, worried about what's going on in the US. And there is, I think, a direct relationship between when Donald Trump and the US does something and what Canadians think is going to happen. Mark Carney won on that safety vote, that I'm here to protect you, I'm the adult in the room. And so that might be also contributing to his success. And we've also seen, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, Matt, several members of various parties deciding they too want to be on the team Mark Carney. And so that kind of momentum as well can also be self-fulfilling. And people see that and they say, well, everyone seems to be with this guy. I read an interesting piece this morning, and I don't know the numbers behind it, but basically it said that Mark Carney's popularity goes beyond the Liberal base and even the Liberal voter. There are Conservatives I have talked to, I'm sure you have as well. There are NDP voters I've talked to, and all of them at least have a grudging respect for the Prime Minister, and some of them feel that he right now is best representing some of their interests. So I think that's what's going on generally in the polls.
I said I wanted to talk about the numbers before I talk about the politics. And the reason I wanted to get the numbers first is because this might sound like a criticism of either Carney or Poilievre, and I actually don't mean it that way. Like what I'm going to say here, I intend as analysis, not commentary. But I cannot explain, based on my observed performance of either gentleman, Mr. Carney or Mr. Poilievre, this significant a shift in the polls, because I don't think Mark Carney has gone on a winning streak the last 3 months, and I don't think Poilievre is stepping on rakes the last 3 months. If anything, I would actually say I think Poilievre has somewhat belatedly begun to adjust his strategy to actually be talking about what the voters seem to care about.
Right.
And instead of seeing continued parity or even a Conservative rise, as the Conservatives kind of belatedly but deliberately start trying to attack the Liberals where they're strong, what we're seeing is this not dramatic, but week by week, it becomes cumulatively significant surge in the Liberal numbers. And nothing that I could observe domestically explains that. Sometimes you see events that move the polls in a big way. There was this happened, or there was a scandal, or there was an event, and you go, well, hey, look at that. I don't see anything when these polls start to diverge that explains this. maybe it's just a gradual process of becoming more comfortable with the prime minister.
I think that's certainly part of it. He's no longer a stranger to Canadians. Not that he really was when he became prime minister. He already had a pretty big profile. But one of the things you said is interesting, that when we looked at the approval rating of Mark Carney between the election of last year in May and this year, it's gone up 10 points. But Mr. Poilievre's approval has also gone up. Your point that he has changed his message, that he's doing more media interviews. I mean, he talked to Peter Mansbridge the other day. Even Paul Wells got him on the show. So, he has changed his tact. I think that he's made some good foreign policy speeches that have been critical of the prime minister, but have also sounded like the adult in the room. But I think that Canadians right now, and we've talked at Ipsos about this idea of the endurance economy, and this is short-term thinking, fear, financial worry. Canadians are feeling like we're going to go into a recession. Most of them are saying that their personal financial situation and their love life have diminished over the last 3 years. And so we're in this precarious period, and this period of an endurance economy. And so in that period, I think that, like I said earlier, the adult in the room or small actions by leaders can give people more confidence perhaps than they would otherwise, because people are just worried. And anybody who feels like or talks like they know what's going on and understand things, be that the prime minister or Mr. Poilievre, is going to have some resonance with people.
You mentioned the Davos speech. I looked at when that speech was, and then I went to 338 Canada, which has the aggregator of all the polls, and they have this. PJ has this very useful plot of like time where he puts all the polls on them, and then you kind of start to see, oh, here's where they scatter. The Davos speech is kind of around that time, and if I had to point to anything as maybe being a trigger for this, it could be that. But I'm skeptical of that, Greg, just because if the Davos speech really meaningfully moved the needle on Canadian domestic politics, it might be the first time foreign policy has ever meaningfully moved the needle on domestic politics. Unless, I guess, and I'll phrase this as a statement, but I guess it's more of a question for you. Maybe this is an example of a situation where a comment on foreign policy landed with a domestic audience as more of a statement of domestic values.
Well, certainly the speech Mr. Carney made was effectively Canada's new foreign policy. He articulated it in a speech, but it might as well have been the foreign policy document of the department. I think the reason that this landed, or might have been correlated with the polling around the time, was it did get a lot of coverage. For the first time since probably 1987, foreign policy is sort of a domestic issue, because everything that's happening with the U.S. and also in trade generally, with China, with the prime minister effectively traveling the world and making foreign policy a signature part of his prime ministership, it's getting the coverage, and Canadians are paying more attention to foreign policy. That isn't to say that all of the issues that we've talked about on this podcast before, affordability, crime, the economy, housing, they're also very important. But Prime Minister seems to have made the case that he's tackling those issues through his foreign policy to a certain extent. So finding new trade partners, increasing productivity. And the government has been very active in talking about these things. Now, that's the risk. And it's interesting. This honeymoon is much longer than any of us really expected. It's atypical for somebody to have this long honeymoon. And of course, this is the same government that has governed for the last 10 years, but he has successfully branded it Canada's new government. I know the Harperites that I've talked to feel like maybe they had the first copyright on that one. But he's continued to have this honeymoon. Eventually, the receipts are going to have to be shown. He's going to have to show some results on some of these things. And, to your point on the foreign policy speech, it was a great speech. It talked about a lot of things we're going to do. But I don't see right now that a lot of things have actually been done to the extent to which Canadians would say, okay, because of this, now I feel like affordability is better or housing is better. It's launched several shadow agencies that have effectively rerouted around the public service to get some of these things done. But all of that is machinery, and we haven't really reached the point yet we can see in the numbers where Canadians are going, okay, where are the results from all of the things that you've been saying you're going to do? And that day will come. And perhaps Mr. Poilievre is waiting for that as well, and has changed his communication tack to reintroduce himself to Canadians to a certain extent.
I'm going to give you a bit of a spoiler of something I've been writing, and it's possible by the time this podcast airs, it'll already have been published. But as of now, it exists only as a gleam in my eye because no editor has accepted it yet. But there were three announcements that really caught my attention recently. And I am mixing my jurisdictions here, my orders of government, and I acknowledge that this is not exactly apples and oranges, but the feds late last week had a big announcement, tens of billions of dollars in Arctic infrastructure, mostly military, some dual-use civilian, things like roads and airports and electrical transmission. But big announcement. It was a recycled announcement. Most of it had already been announced. The Ontario government recently announced a national agreement on an energy corridor. And I read the thing 12 times. And I had no idea what it was saying. So I grabbed a source in the Ontario government who told me on background that the announcement is an agreement to have meetings to come to an agreement on what the priorities would be. And then once we have that agreement, we will seek an agreement with Ottawa to fund it. So we have an agreement. It's an agreement to have an agreement to get an agreement. And then meanwhile, also coming out of the Government of Ontario newsroom, is that we, Ontarians, now have an agreement with Nova Scotia to allow direct-to-consumer liquor sales across provincial lines, knocking down one of those internal trade barriers, which I think is great. I also think an energy transmission corridor would be great, and I think enhanced Arctic infrastructure would be great. But when I'm looking at the announcements versus the deliverables here, the only thing we've actually been able to figure out is to allow Nova Scotia to ship beer to my house. When it comes to actually building an electrical transmission corridor, we need 2 more agreements before we could even start to do it. And then the defense stuff, we're just recycling announcements for the Arctic here. I have been grumpier than most, Greg, on saying about the Liberal government, I need to see results here. I like the Prime Minister. I got no problem with the guy. I certainly prefer him to his predecessor. Am I being a curmudgeon by simply noting we haven't actually seen much happen yet?
Well, you being a journalist, most people don't read trade agreements 12 times. But I feel like you're expressing a little bit of what I'm talking about in that, people are waiting to see where the next shoe is going to drop, that short-term thinking. And the Prime Minister has been busy, just like the Premier, just like a lot of political leaders, announcing possible agreements or accords, a possible trade agreement with India, a possible trade agreement, or, the frame of one with China. We're talking about, doing something, and even Mr. Poilievre talked about CANZU, so Canada, US, or Canada, UK, New Zealand, and Australia, which is an interesting idea that kind of goes back to our Commonwealth roots. But to your point, Matt, a lot of these things right now are just conversations, and I think that sooner or later we should see some impatience, but we're not seeing that in the polls right now. We are seeing people really giving the government the benefit of the doubt on getting things done. And so we'll wait and see whether they actually do. But you read more of the stuff than most people.
Yeah, that's why I'm so much fun at parties. Okay, you had mentioned this before, and I put a kind of a mental note on that because I want to come back to it. If Carney is indeed, as the polls show, opening up a lead right now, I agree with you. It is probably based on reaction to things coming out of Washington. How does that align with what Canadians are telling you they actually care about? Because, one of the things and I know is that Canadians will talk a lot about issues X, Y, and Z, but then you actually poll Canadians, and they're on the list, but they're in like 14th, 17th, and 22nd place for their priorities, right? What are the issues that Canadians actually care about right now?
They haven't really shifted a lot. The economy and affordability are still number one. We still see housing in there. Crime is an issue for some people in certain areas, although that I think we've seen less talk about, but we've seen a lot of violence against Jewish communities just recently, in fact. That's a concern, I think, that the Canadians in some areas are very worried about. The linkage, I think, to some of the more economic priorities that the Prime Minister is successfully making is that he says, I'm going to solve some of these things through these agreements, through diversifying our relationships, through better trade agreements and better relationships with other partners. And so he's making the linkage between foreign policy and economic domestic policy implicitly. perhaps in ways that we haven't seen before. Now, one of the big things that's coming up that I don't think we're talking about enough, and I don't have any new numbers on this, although one of the other polling firms did do a poll on this, and that's the CUSMA renegotiation. And so we are really walking into that, I think, with a lot at stake. The poll that one of our competitors did, which, I have no reason to disbelieve, said that, about half of Canadians feel like it would be okay if we didn't have CUSMA. Now, you got to remember, we have benefited tremendously from CUSMA over this period. All of the talk about the tariffs destroying Canada's economy, all of the warnings from the banks and that didn't come to pass precisely because, well, there were targeted tariffs on certain things. Generally, we have not paid a high level of tariffs because of CUSMA. I think it's naive to believe that the U.S. is not going to try and extract some concessions from the next negotiation. We're not going to end up with the same deal. This idea that we might have no deal is one that you've seen, former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley talk about and say, well, maybe it's okay. We survived before. We can survive again. I think a lot of that might be emotional bargaining or just saying, well, it's going to be okay, because certainly the benefits of NAFTA and CUSMA have been, I would argue, tremendous for both Canadians and Americans and Mexicans. But if the administration is determined to change the rules on that and change them in a more fundamental way than perhaps we expect or the president has talked about, we do need to prepare for this possibility of negotiations not being easy. And then where is your BATNA? Where is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement on that? I'm sure the Prime Minister and the government are thinking about this, but I think this is going to be something that Canadians are going to have to confront over the next year or two as this becomes real. And this idea that we don't have a trade agreement with our biggest partner, and all of these side agreements the Prime Minister is trying to sign don't become nice and diverse. First, it doesn't become nice to have, it becomes an absolute necessity. I don't think we're there yet. And that's why there's a lot of talk about making an agreement to make an agreement.
I don't think we're there yet either. And I don't know how much the public's paying attention, but I suspect they'll have an intuitive sense of it. And look, the latest economic numbers weren't terrible, but they weren't great.
Well, the jobs report came in this morning. It was
not good.
Not the best. Yeah.
80,000 jobs gone last month, which I think was not what had been expected. And there was something I heard just a few days ago, Greg, and I was driving around in my car running errands, and because of the current kerfuffle in the Middle East, sorry, I slipped into technical jargon there, the current kerfuffle.
You mean the war?
There's a ship full of food that got stranded, and the food was destined to Toronto's Daily Bread Food Bank. And as part of the story that was being presented on the radio, there was sort of this casual one-sentence mention that 10% of Toronto's population is food insecure. And I thought about that for a second. There's more than 3 million people who live in the city of Toronto proper, the 416. 300,000 of them can't feed themselves. And, we talk about housing, you mentioned housing, and housing starts are down. Like, they're trending in the wrong direction. And there's been some drop in housing prices as well, which is part of why housing starts are down. Crime remains an active concern. You've mentioned the anti-Semitism. I'm not laying any or all of this specifically at the feet of Mark Carney. But I am saying right now, I don't see a situation in this country that warrants a prime minister's approval ratings going up 10% and an 8-point lead over a formerly tied rival. I just don't see it. And I get that vibes are a thing. I really do. But country don't run on vibes, man. That ain't how this is going to work in the long run. And you said something a minute ago I thought was so smart, where you said John Manley might be engaged in a bit of emotional bargaining. Hey, man, I got nothing against emotional bargaining. I spend probably half my waking hours these days engaging in a little emotional bargaining of my own. But we're not going to be able to bargain our way out of the poorhouse by making ourselves feel better by rereading the Davos speech. Like, we actually have an economy we need to run here. And at the rate things are going, I'm amazed you and I haven't been named trade delegate to Bolivia or something, because we're going to need them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to my point earlier, most people didn't read the Davos speech. Most people probably read about the Davos speech, and got a good vibe from it, to use that terminology. But I mentioned the endurance economy, and this is, I think, a fundamental thing that Canadians are facing. They're not thinking long term; they're thinking short term. 300,000 people in Toronto is a lot of people who all they can worry about is feeding their families, and so they're probably not worried about the Prime Minister's Davos speech. They are waiting for, I think, a lot of things to change, because you've talked about a multitude of problems. What we termed a while ago, the poly crisis, where you have several things happening. But we now think at Ipsos, and we have numbers that show this, that we're out of sort of the affordability crisis and now into what I call a chronic condition. And my colleague Mike College wrote a little bit about this for you guys. So in that condition, context is really important. And you're evaluating Mark Carney in the context of, perhaps when we might have looked at a politician previously, when we weren't facing all of these different challenges. Although I should say this stuff's been going on for a long time in Canada. We haven't really been paying attention. COVID really did us a disservice by interrupting the process by which we would have maybe noticed this earlier. But in the current context, where we have hostilities in the Middle East, we have this food crisis, we have the anti-Semitism, we have a housing crisis, we have inflation that is being driven by a variety of things. Even if the inflation basket doesn't say it's up, everyone I talk to says, no, food is up. I feel things are more expensive. And there's a bit of a disconnect between, I would say, the spreadsheets in Ottawa and the spreadsheets across the kitchen table. But that's not translating right now into approval rating from Mark Carney. And I think, like I said, the reason for that is people are just focused short term. You mentioned housing. Saw a stat the other day that we had, because we've been starting to look at a demographic on our polls. When we ask at the end of a poll, how old are you and gender and all that, we ask people, what's your living situation? And we want to know how many people are literally living in their parents' basements. I think the number was close to 50% in Toronto, 18 to 34, are living with their parents in some sort of scenario. Now, some of those probably are multi-generational families where, culturally they all live together. That's a very high number. And the housing crisis is a wicked problem, because the builds that you talk about that aren't starting for a variety of reasons, the amount of money that goes into any new build that is administrative. But the other problem is the people who need the houses can't afford the houses that are maybe for sale by the people who want to sell them, because of that huge disconnect. I mean, you cannot in this country devalue housing to the point where those people can afford them, because then the baby boomers and the people who have invested their entire retirement savings into the house are going to have something to say about that. So there's a gap, and it's not an easy problem to solve, compounded by the fact that inflation is causing it to be more difficult to build. Supply chain interruptions are causing it to be more difficult to acquire the things you need to do it. And all of those municipal regulations and federal and provincial and the little charges here and there. I don't know the number, but it's a significant amount in the six figures that is added to the cost of a new house just to comply with regulatory requirements.
So a couple of specific questions I wanted to ask you to kind of to bring us back in a bit from the big picture, more of the small picture here. I want to talk about regional stuff, but before we do, let's kind of do one more question on the federal front. Pierre Poilievre has, the last couple of months, I think you've summed it up really well. He's had a tonal shift. He's going on media outlets he hasn't gone on before. We've thought about inviting him on, to be honest. Like my gut feeling is that there's this is me betraying kind of a bias as a media guy. I don't think interviewing politicians is that productive. And, if there's been a tragedy or an announcement that is within a politician's geographic region or policy portfolio, then I don't mind having them on to talk about what actually happened. But in general, I don't see much value in getting spun by spinners. Like, it's just meh. So you will notice if you go back and read extensively through the line, we don't spend a lot of time talking to politicians. But hey, he's talking to everybody. Maybe we'll invite him on. He is having an approval rating rebound a little bit. It's not helping him in the polls. And, it's strange because Poilievre is a guy whose party was popular and his policies were popular, but he was unpopular. And, I remember about a year ago, we were talking about his women problem. Women voters didn't like him, or older boomers didn't like him, and et cetera here. He seems to be taking the steps necessary to address it, and he has never been further behind. What do you make of that? What do you think strategically the Conservatives are trying to do, but what do you think is maybe at this point working against them?
Well, I mentioned he's reintroducing himself to Canadians, and I think that's what they're doing now. I mean, we have both noticed as observers of this, and I have no inside information on this. You might a change in his tone and his approach to some of these media opportunities. A lot of the issues that not only matter to Canadians, but that the Prime Minister has said matter to him are issues that were raised by the Conservatives. So, give Mr. Poilievre credit for actually raising these things, I think, before a lot of people did. And, I think one of the things that has ailed him is he's been a really effective opposition leader. And I think there's an old saying, you get the job you audition for. The carbon tax was a huge thing that he managed to, I would say, you can take a lot of credit in having Mark Carney come in and make one of his first acts to remove that. He has raised the issue of crime. He's been very, very strong on the anti-Semitism front and a supporter of Israel. He has been talking about affordability for a long time. Some of the catchphrases I think maybe have not landed with some people, and I think part of the personality problem might stem from that. But by and large, on the issues, there isn't a lot of daylight between the Conservatives and the Liberals on their approach. And so then it becomes, a couple of questions that have to be answered. Why switch if you guys are all going to do the same thing? Some of the baggage that Mr. Poilievre has as a career politician, like it or not, Mark Carney is still, I think, perceived as not a politician, as a banker who decided to, get into politics. Mr. Poilievre has always been a politician. And frankly, if Canadians are sitting there and they're saying, well, would I rather Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre negotiating with Donald Trump or managing some of these issues, I have to conclude that they're saying, well, I would rather it be Mark Carney. So that's a hard thing to overcome because, the personality and the reputation of the Prime Minister coming into this job was substantial. And of course, we saw that in the shift in the polls that, we didn't even see coming in December of 2024. So I think the Conservatives are doing the right things and they're talking about the right issues, certainly aligned to the polls that we're seeing. But it's very hard to get through on that when your opponent is talking about the same things or using your ideas and effectively communicating them to an international audience and getting lauded in domestic media for doing so. But still.
All right. Regional questions.
Yes.
Quebec, PQ looking like it's going to win, although the polls have actually tightened a little bit, which I think is interesting. So we shouldn't count our chickens before they hatch in Quebec, I guess, but also Alberta, two provinces with sort of active secessionist, separatist campaigns. But in both cases, I pay attention to both. Neither of them seem likely to vote to succeed, but there's a core there, somewhere in the 20-30% range in both. And, that's enough where a good campaign or some unexpected events can start making things interesting. But at the same time, as we're talking, you know what? I'll ask the Alberta question separately. What's going on in Quebec? What do you think?
Well, same thing that was going on federally. You got a tired government, a tired leader who people loved at the beginning. And then all of a sudden they decided, no, thank you. Mr. Legault has resigned. He's trying to pull the same trick, I guess, that Mr. Trudeau did and replace himself with a new leader and then rescue the party from the polls. The Liberals in Quebec have a new leader, which, you mentioned the polls are tightening. I don't have any of our numbers, but they are from some of our competitors. I think I saw 35-30, which is as tight as I think I've seen it. The PQ victory is no assured thing. And ironically, the more they talk about sovereignty in that, the more some of the voters who have gone to them because they didn't see an alternative might say, well, maybe there's some other alternatives now. And or when it looks like the PQ is not going to be elected, they might say, I might vote PQ. But as that becomes more likely, they might say, well, they don't need my vote anymore. I have to lend it to them. I can go back somewhere else. As an Anglophone who lives in Quebec and one who lived in Alberta for 7 years, it's interesting. The two provinces that are being talked about are two that I've lived in both. I think that the Liberals need to, in Quebec, broaden their appeal to Francophones. The language issues are really significant here, and the Francophones vote needs to have assurances around the protection of French. There's really no way around that. But the Liberals don't have broad appeal right now in the Francophone vote. They have basically locked up the Anglophone vote, and that's the real differentiator here. So we'll see what the new leader does. But I think, like all races, the only vote that matters is the one that happens on election day. And it could be an interesting summer as both the PQ and the Liberals and of course the CAQ try and recover. And then there's a few other regional players in Quebec, or smaller players, I should say, Quebec Solidaire and the Quebec Conservative Party, that they don't tend to win a lot of seats, but they can certainly siphon off a lot of votes and change some of the riding races.
Alberta, because we've got all this secessionist talk, but we also have something else. And I remember seeing it in one poll a month or two ago and kind of shaking my head going, clearly a fluke, but now poll after poll has showed it, I think you guys included. The Liberals are getting more popular in Alberta.
They are. We're seeing an increase in support. Now, I don't know how strong that support is or whether it translates to the ballot box, but I think in Calgary, certainly there is more maybe Liberal support. In Edmonton, which, by the way, you and your listeners will remember, that was where Rachel Notley won her government in 2014, was in that Edmonton area. And so in Alberta, you've got the two cities, Edmonton and Calgary, and then you've got sort of the rest of Alberta, which is an unfair characterization, but from an electoral and numbers perspective, it kind of makes sense. And you need to win two of those to take the province. If the Liberals can get some support in Calgary and zero in on a few ridings, they won a surprise one with Corey Hogan last election in Calgary. In the Edmonton riding, I've seen some others who have said that the riding where Mr. General crossed the floor is actually leaning Liberal right now, and I don't know if that's true because Mr. General won with a pretty large Conservative vote. And we could talk about floor crossing if you want as well. We did some polling on that, but Alberta is an interesting case. And of course, the concern about the sovereignty vote in both Quebec and Alberta is not the 50%, because I personally right now am not worried that in either case the referendum will succeed. It's the question that Howard Anglin asked the other day in the Hub, and Daryl Bricker and I have talked about. It's, what do you do with 40%? 40% is large enough that you can't ignore it. It's not large enough that there's a mandate to separate, but it's certainly a message. And the problem, I think, we've seen in Quebec, I mean, we risk reliving, is that appeasement begins and you start to see things given to Alberta. And then the question is, well, what about the other provinces? I published a paper yesterday with the University of Regina about Saskatchewan and Alberta, and we had a very small sample in Saskatchewan, so I want to really, really caveat that. But there is some evidence that the national unity divisions in Canada have improved in Alberta since 2019, but Saskatchewan have remained the same or perhaps worse, and that there's a core of people in Saskatchewan, the Buffalo Project folks, who are more sovereigntist than even Albertans. And so, you could see a situation where you've got those two united provinces making demands. And then, of course, the difference in Alberta to Quebec is there's a contingent of sovereigntists in Quebec whose goal is not to necessarily separate and start their own country, but to join the United States. And we've seen in the numbers that one of the risks facing the Conservative parties is that a lot of these sovereigntists are actually Conservative voters.
One last question for you here, and then I'll wrap it, but it's exactly what you were just talking about here. The only thing I can think of that explains a measurable Liberal rise in Alberta is backlash against secessionism, where there are Albertans out there who are center-right and would normally vote Conservative, but they're Canadian, they're Federalist, and they don't like what they're seeing. And they're seeing the Liberals as a place they can park their vote without worrying that it's going to be soft or otherwise a support for separatism.
Yep, I think that, there's something to that. One of the biggest offenders of Canada, one of the biggest ardent anti-separatists has been Jason Kenney. You've heard a lot from him recently. He's very active on social media. One of the things that is going to be a real test for the Conservatives, and I mean the small c Conservatives, is within that group, there are some people who are maybe not as proud to be Canadian as the Liberals, who have nothing to really deal with on this front. Nobody's asking them. Questions that Mr. Poilievre is going to get and Daniel Smith is getting now are going to be, how many in your caucus or in your movement are secessionists in Alberta? And that'll be a difficult question to answer. So yes, if you're somebody who's worried about this, the Liberals seem like a pretty safe place to put that vote.
Always a pleasure to have you here. Lots to talk about. Thanks for this. Keep pulling those numbers. But Greg, always a pleasure, man. Thanks for coming on with me. I'll look forward to doing it again. But in the meantime, keep up the great work.
Thanks a lot, Matt.
That was Gregory Jack of Ipsos. Coming up in moments, joining me here on the line, David Shipley, CEO of Beauceron. He's our go-to cybersecurity guy here at the line, talking about the war in Iran. Stay tuned. This message is brought to you by the Forest Products Association of Canada. In a volatile world, Canada has to focus on what we can control right here at home. Prime Minister Carney says a country that can't build itself has few options. The forest products sector provides the literal building blocks for our country, from the lumber and wood products to build new homes and infrastructure, to pulp and paper for household and business use, to the renewable power we need to support energy security. We're already a global trade success story, and we're ready to do more to build a resilient, self-reliant country. It's time to focus on Canada's domestic strengths. Learn more at www.fpac.ca. David Shipley, Beauceron Security CEO there, one of our go-to cybersecurity experts. Dave, we've got a whole new war unfolding in the Middle East right now, and I'm not going to ask you about the kinetic side of it. I'm not going to ask you about the mines or the airstrikes or the missiles or whatever, but let's talk about the cyber domain here. Mostly, we're going to talk about how the Iranians are hitting back, but it's worth noting, I guess it was a year or two ago, it's all starting to blur together, but when the Israelis hit Hezbollah with their beeper attack, and you and I had a chat about that, and we were just talking about the degree of forethought that had to go into that, like to nudge Hezbollah in the direction of deciding they wanted to use beepers, to build the beepers, to infiltrate them in a way that wasn't detected, and then to wait the moment to actually unleash that. The Israelis were thinking years ahead here. The Ayatollah got killed at the opening moment of this war with a precision airstrike on exactly where he was. And what we found out was that the Israelis, according to reporting, were able to pull that off because they couldn't identify the Ayatollah, his location, but they figured out who his bodyguards were. They hacked Tehran's traffic camera network, and they started tracking the bodyguards as they went to work. And then they knew exactly where they were congregating, and they took it out with an airstrike. In terms of the sophistication here, it's not just the technical sophistication of being able to get into the traffic cameras. It's the planning sophistication of coming up with a plan and executing it over years and never getting caught.
Well, if there's anything that we're learning here is that the key with cyber, particularly cyber that will be used for kinetic, is patience. And, to use a Star Trek reference, revenge is a dish best served cold, and it's best served quietly and patiently, and brilliant in its execution. And it's not just restricted to nation states. Remember, last year we reported that a Mexican cartel tracked an FBI legal attaché through the streets of Mexico City, tracking down all of the people speaking out of turn to that individual. And they either got, at best, a severe beating or at worst, murdered. So this is now in the hands of criminal gangs up to the nation state. And yeah, it's brilliant, and it's why Iran cut off its own internet hours into this conflict. Initially, we had suspected the Americans and others had DDoS them off the planet, but on retrospect, we realized that would be so incredibly stupid given how much they have been able to pervasively hack and own in that environment. No, it was an interesting example of nation-state self-defense, and there's only a few countries on the planet that can actually effectively do that. Russia, Iran, North Korea. Imagine Canada facing a catastrophic known infiltration into critical systems. We wouldn't even know where to start to put our shields up and cut ourselves off.
I always love a podcast when we immediately break out the Klingon proverbs. Hopefully we won't get all the way to today is a good day to die, because I don't like the trend lines globally. Look, I think you and I have talked about this, and we haven't even talked about it publicly always, but you and I are both well aware of cybersecurity incidents within the federal government that was basically at the level of, does anyone know who we're supposed to call right now? Oh, the phones don't work anyway. Oops. So yeah, I hear you on that one. Yeah, there was something else that the Israelis and the Americans did, which is I think falls more in the propaganda realm. But one of the things, and I'm sure you saw this, is that they interrupted Iranian state TV and delivered messages directly to the Iranian people from Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Like, our fight is not with you. We are targeting your oppressors. Like, be careful. Like, we are conducting operations in your area, but we wish you no harm. I remember I have visions in my head just from movies and stuff, nothing I ever saw personally, but leaflet campaigns, right? Like planes flying overhead and you rain leaflets down on the enemy civilians. Now you just hack their phones and their TV signals and you send them a text. It's just a completely different way of actually doing messaging here. And again, the Iranians had no defense for it. How long did they have the ability to interrupt state TV? And they just sat on it until it was useful.
And that's the part, like whenever you hear the cyber nerds like me talking about so-called advanced persistent threats, the important letter is P, persistence. And so, that's the Sesame Street lesson for cyber for the day. But it wasn't just the state TV hacks. The other one that was Chef's Kiss 5 out of 5 hacking was a prayer app used by 5 million individuals. And they were able to send targeted propaganda to soldiers in particular saying, now is a good time to consider another career, which is really interesting. And it's the first time a Western cyber op has been acknowledged on the app side. The last time we saw an interesting app hack was actually being done by Hamas targeting Israeli soldiers, and they built a soccer app so they could track troop deployments. And that got them a helicopter delivered missile into their cyber development team office building at the time. Also interesting to note that the Iranian cyber headquarters is now a smoking hole, but they're still persisting. So that's been the other interesting thing related to the war is, of course, GPS hacking has been massive. So the Strait of Hormuz obviously has become a really interesting geographical point for everybody right now.
Yeah.
And we've got tanker ships showing up like they're inland Saudi Arabia. If you're a pop culture fan, this is the essentially the plot of Tomorrow Never Dies. I love it when Bond films become reality. And so the GPS system, the identification EIS system for ships, they're completely hacked. So safe navigation, good luck with that. And that's when you see the amount of traffic that actually goes through this place. And lastly, everyone's focused on the oil component, but let's go back to cyber and tech for a second. Taiwanese and South Korean chip makers need a lot of helium to produce microchips. A lot of that helium comes from Qatar. A lot of that helium ain't been shipping. So this is more than just at the pump.
I remember I did see that. Probably you and I are looking at the same image. It showed an oil freighter in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert, right? Because the GPS coordinates were just scrambled. A couple of months ago, I was never able to write about this. I hoped to, but things got a little hectic over here and I wasn't able to write the column. But it was a European security official who was at a conference I was at who basically said for war planning purposes, they're now assuming GPS doesn't last the opening hour. So they're either going to need NATO networks or sovereign state capacity or dead reckoning with a compass and a map and a protractor, because we're getting to the point where anyone with even reasonably sophisticated cyber capabilities is going to be able to take out the GPS network very, very quickly. You don't have to destroy the satellites. That's what the Americans used to be worried about. They used to be worried about some sort of kinetic interceptor that destroys these things in orbit, or some kind of laser system that'll blind them, or an EMP in low orbit to fry the satellites. No, you can just hack the ground stations now, and the next thing you know, your artillery is landing in the parking lot of a coffee shop somewhere instead of on the enemy headquarters.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and some nation states are building their own domestic global positioning systems now. China, for example, is putting forward its own agenda on that. So, so it's been interesting, which has led to, I think, the other side is, okay, so these are the punches Tehran has taken. How are they dishing it back? And that's been interesting, and in ways that we hadn't expected.
Well, tell me about one of them. You had actually flagged this for me, Dave, a couple of days ago. just for the viewers and the listeners here, Dave often does do this. He flags for me, hey, this is going on, this is going on, you should check it out. There was, correct me if I'm wrong, an American-based medical company?
Yeah, so Stryker, which is a $25 billion a year, 60,000 employee global provider of orthopedic and neurosurgery equipment, including things like stents, parts for orthopedic surgery, replacements, etc. These guys are important. These guys are 40% of the North American orthopedics supply market. On Wednesday, a Iranian-linked group hacked into their systems, accessed their own self-destruct button for all of their devices, something called Microsoft Intune, and wiped 200,000 devices, they claim, including employees' personal phones that had Outlook installed, corporate laptops, servers, etc. They wiped this company's Microsoft productivity environment off the map. You don't recover from that quickly. No organization I'm aware of has ever had to, at that employee size, at that global distribution, at that criticality in our healthcare system, ever had to recover. They are pen and paper right now.
You and I had talked years ago, and I remember at the time you and I were actually both being circumspect in what we said because we didn't want to give any bad guys ideas here. But if you go into the IT back end of a large logistics company and you wipe it out, we're talking 9 missed meals to anarchy, because just-on-time delivery is the norm across North America. Going after medical devices to me is interesting. It's like it's a high-profile target, it's a vulnerable target, and it's one that's going to actually have a meaningful effect here. There are people who might need surgery in 3 months who won't get it because the stent supply will have run out, and that's a big deal. So I understand why that's a pain point here. But I could imagine worse. If I was looking to actually lay some hurt down on the great Satan or the little Satan, I don't know, maybe Stryker was vulnerable. Like maybe there was something that let the Iranians get in. Maybe they tried other targets here. But what you're telling me, man, is bad. Could be worse.
Yeah, and I think target of opportunity is probably the right categorization at this point. But remember, Iranian teams have been in multiple American water supply systems. They have tried to poison those systems in the past. They are likely still trying to poison those systems, even more so now. And they're partnering with criminal groups now to acquire tools, further obfuscate their accountability, responsibility, attribution. So they're hacking everything everywhere as much as they can to respond as effectively as possible. And what's interesting is that, in this Stryker medical attack, because it's interesting these groups have a bit of a PR spin to them. They knew they were hitting a medical device and they were impacting innocent civilians, and their justification was to punch back for their allegations that the Americans hit an all-girls school in Tehran. And so what's interesting is that not just the cyber attack itself, but the psychology of justifying attacks on civilian infrastructure on the side. But yes, it could be worse. If this thing drags out, it will likely get much worse on this side, and the bill is going to come due in other critical areas. So, I think it's fair to say that food supply is a big question. JBS Meats a couple years ago got smoked by a criminal group, and that was a quarter of the North American protein supply that was potentially days away from a catastrophic supply chain collapse. So yeah, it can get more real quick. Not to mention the fact, 43% of the cars driving in North American roads right now are all connected to the internet and horribly insecure. So yeah,
nothing to worry about.
No.
So I want to talk with you just briefly about regime survival. My last episode on the line a couple of weeks ago, one of the things we talked about with both my guests on that episode was how the Iranian regime has known that there was the prospect of a war like this. And I think somewhat to the frustration of the Israelis and the Americans, and probably more to the surprise of the Americans. I don't think the Israelis are surprised, but the Americans seem to be. The regime hasn't rolled over, at least as the time you and I are recording this. Like they are intending to push forward and go and continue to fight back. You had already mentioned a few minutes ago, Dave, that the actual physical infrastructure of Iran's cyber groups has been destroyed. It was on the early target list. But the problem is the Iranians knew this was going to happen. The moment the bombs started dropping, I bet all these guys grabbed their phones and laptops and just walked out. And they're all logging in from random internet cafes across Tehran and continuing to work. And you'd actually mentioned to me that it's worse even than that, because it's not just having contingency plans to distribute the actual architecture of the state's cybersecurity, cyber warfare apparatus. They're starting to just go on the open market and hire basically hired guns, contractors, mercenaries. What do we even call these guys?
Well, I mean, we would have called them privateers back in the day. They're getting their letters of marque. So they're on the cyber black market. They're buying hacking tools. So for their existing teams, they're still operating. They're just like, hey, it's dumb for us to try and build all of our own tooling right now. It's better to use stuff, and then there's going to be misattribution. So great, let's do that. And let's mobilize as many folks as possible. Handala, the group responsible for the striker hit, has ties back to Palestinian groups. So, they're finding their friends and allies. Various Russian hacktivist groups, Z-Pen Test and others, have decided to help. Even though, Putin and Xi Jinping's approach to support to them has been, we're with you in spirit, thoughts and prayers. On the cyber, they're rallying some of the troops to help. There's been reports from American media of Russian intelligence and hacking used to help with Iranian drone strike targeting, which, by the way, that clever little hack of various cameras works both ways. And so, we'll see more of that. So the other thing that might help with regime survival is they're going to take a page from the North Korean playbook. We're seeing reports from major cybersecurity intelligence firms that they're getting back into the ransomware game in a big way. That's cash. They need cash right now. So there's lots of ways that they can survive, and they can cause a lot of havoc along the way.
I remember years and years and years ago reading a first-person account of the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, where there'd been the shock and awe air campaign, and the ground troops are going in. And in the main, rather than standing and fighting and dying, the Republican Guard and the conventional Iraqi military melted away. Mm-hmm. And some reports from Iran of similar things happening in the regular army, not hearing much about the Revolutionary Guard yet. But it was just a reporter. I wish I could remember where it was. I would have gone and Googled the article, but it was a reporter who was traveling with some U.S. troops, and they were rolling into some Iraqi town or something. And the population came out, and they were cheering, and they were waving flags, and they were celebrating their liberation, and they were tearing down Saddam's statues. And one of the American soldiers is smiling and waving and handing out chocolate bars. And he's noticing that half the guys in the crowd celebrating the arrival of the Americans are very fit young men with crew cuts. And he remembers saying to one of his officers, hey, man, look at all the Iraqi regulars celebrating our arrival dressed in their civilian clothes, right? Like right now in Iran, a lot of these guys have just changed back into their Adidas tracksuits and put on their Reeboks and threw their laptop if they're a cyber warrior, or threw their guns if they're one of the regime thugs, into the trunk. And they're just hanging out. And they're going to come back as soon as this is over. And I'm honestly wondering, because we've seen, Dave, we've seen protests in Iran and cheering crowds. I wonder how many people don't even realize yet that a video of them cheering is on some hard drive that survived the bombing, and they're going to get a knock on the door 6 months after the U.S. loses interest and goes home.
Yeah, and how many Western AI tools are going to be used to make that a really efficient way of culling the herd?
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, this is exactly what the Americans have said that they intend to do with, and AI tools is mass domestic surveillance and other things, because it's actually really good at that. That's what the machines are good at. It's pattern recognition. It is stupid easy. And the other part about the something I've started talking about is the potential for cyber Ronin. So an Iranian crew took down an American children's hospital a few years ago. And we were never quite sure if that was a state sanctioned thing or if that was like, hey guys, we got some free time. You want to try and make some money on the side.
Yeah.
And so while they're doing the fighting age males hanging out, waiting to see how this all plays out, they got skills. They got skills to pay the bills. And great. And they may be even more further off the leash. Not that there was much of a leash they were on before. So, what happens to, and this is an interesting thing we've never seen before. Like, what happens when you basically create a cyber mercenary group that eventually has to make some money to pay the bills if the state stops paying? So there's a lot of different fallout here. I will note, just as the cynical part of myself, that 4 years ago I warned that we really need to pass critical infrastructure cyber laws in Canada. They are still being debated in committee, and I feel so much safer because we're taking our sweet, sweet time securing our critical infrastructure.
Well, we'll just add that to the major projects office list of to-dos, and yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine. David Shipley, CEO, Beauceron Security. As always, you've really raised the mood. I feel better. I suspect you feel better. The listeners and the viewers really, they learned a lot. They're probably now hiding under their desks, but I appreciate your time as always, man. Thanks for coming on.
You're always welcome.
Thanks for joining me, guys. It's another episode of On the Line in the Books. Greg Jack and David Shipley, my guests, Greg from Ipsos and David from Beauceron. Check us out, as always, at readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe. We will not be back with an episode of the Line podcast on this Friday because it's March break. So we hope you enjoyed this one, and we will talk to you soon, but we got lots of written content coming out, so we'll keep an eye open for that. As always, like and subscribe. Have a great week.